Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Prokesch, a senior editor at the Harvard Business Review, and I'll be your moderator for today's conversation around ways retailers are thriving through change. We'll start with a look at this complicated holiday season, then discuss the outlook for the new year and beyond. Throughout the discussion, we'll focus on agile ways of working as retailers adapt to a world of unpredictable and accelerating change. I'm joined here today by Matthew Shay, President and CEO of the National Retail Federation, and Darrell Rigby, a partner at Bain Company and co-author of the new book, Doing Agile Right. Some quick housekeeping notes. We'll spend the first 40 minutes or so in a moderated Q&A, and we'll then open it up to questions from the audience for the last portion of the conversation. We encourage you to start typing now your questions into the Q&A window throughout the conversation, and our Q&A moderator will manage the queue. Okay, let's dig right in. Darrell, can you help set the stage? We've heard so much about a retail apocalypse. What is the state of retail and how important are agile ways of working for retailers?
Well, thanks, Steve. It's great to be with you and Matt. You know, the strange thing is that on average, the retail industry is actually quite healthy. We're seeing some new quarterly results trickle in this morning, and on average, retail sales are quite strong, remarkably healthy, up 8, 9, even 10%. And that's pretty impressive. In fact, Bain expects retail holiday sales to be up at least 2% in November and December. I guess that's the good news. The problem is that I can't seem to find a single retail executive who is feeling anything like that average. Because if you're talking to executives in apparel or department stores or electronics and appliances, all of them are fighting declining demand and trying to cut costs as quickly as they can to stay afloat. But you talk to executives in e-commerce and home improvement or sporting goods and grocery stores, and they're fighting to keep up with booming sales and doing that without disappointing their customers or putting their employees at risk. So, you know, even the general merchandisers who are growing near the average rate are seeing some pretty dramatic shifts among categories and among channels, from stores to online, for example. So I guess it's a little like if you're hiking Mount Everest and the Grand Canyon, it might sound like a walk in the park on average, but the journey feels quite different than that. And what this means is that within a pretty good retail market, there's actually going to be extraordinary winners and extraordinary losers. And these are remarkably challenging conditions. It's the kind of conditions that Agile was designed to deal with. And I think a lot of retail executives are actually, of necessity, adopting more Agile principles and practices, more teamwork, more effective prioritization, more creativity, faster decisions. And that's great. I think it is true that most retailers are probably innovating faster than they have ever innovated before. But the truth is they still aren't moving fast enough or far enough. We're getting feedback from customers who tell us that their satisfaction levels with 3/4 of retailers is actually falling. Employees tell us that they're burned out and exhausted, and that red tape and bureaucracies are still big problems. And executives themselves tell us that this new world of unpredictable and accelerating change, not just with the pandemic, but with social unrest and digital disruptions and trade wars and regulatory changes and natural disasters, are definitely going to require new ways of working that they're just frankly beginning to understand.
Matt, what is your perspective on the so-called retail apocalypse?
Well, Steve, it's nice to be with you, and Darrell, who is so well known and such a great friend and an expert in the industry. So really a pleasure to be with you both. I guess I would look at it this way. You know, the retail industry has evolved and adapted for hundreds of years. I mean, in our own experience, at least for decades. And every time retail is counted out, I think we've concluded that it's not retail per se, right? I mean, we're talking about commerce, we're talking about consumerism, we're talking about individual customer behaviors changing and evolving and transforming very, very rapidly in the current environment, and really being accelerated by COVID-19. That means individual companies will have different experiences. And just as in a booming market, as we saw over the last, say, decade, coming out of the last recession, when consumers were becoming increasingly healthy, the unemployment rate was decreasing, consumer confidence was increasing, interest rates were low, spending power was increasing across households. Even in an environment like that, success is not distributed evenly across all businesses. There were winners and losers in that environment. And in the current environment, in which many of the patterns that we've seen emerging over the last 5 years, the use of mobile, the use of different digital technologies and engagement with customers, changes to the supply chain, changes to fulfillment, all of those rapid transformations taking place. Not all businesses were able to effectively adapt to that. And so COVID-19 has really been an accelerant of those changed consumer behaviors. And we've seen even arbitrary decisions, the so-called decisions about which businesses were essential and which were non-essential, which wasn't based on the health and safety of those businesses, which, if we stop and think about it, we're supposed to be adopting behaviors that promote health and safety. Well, there's nothing inherently unsafe about being in a shoe store relative to being in a produce market. It's not about the products that get sold. It's about the behaviors in those respective businesses. But nevertheless, as we saw some winners and losers emerge on the essential, non-essential front, some were allowed to remain open, some were forced to close. That was another accelerant on this rapid transformation and change, and separated, in many cases, the two cohorts, those that are doing extraordinarily well in terms of their ability to respond to the market. Notwithstanding, I think everything Darrell said makes sense. Even those businesses are grappling with the need to move so very quickly to adopt all of those new behaviors into a business model that didn't have those as present, a year ago. And you've even seen CEOs saying, we think, how much of this is going to sustain, how much of this new behavior will be permanent. But nevertheless, it gave advantages over those that were not allowed to be open. No retailer is built to be closed. And so you need those physical places. Maybe we don't need as many of them. We're going to continue to see that transition and transformation. But I think, Steve, really to answer your question, what's going on now is another one of those evolutions of the industry, those massive disruptions. And we saw it, we didn't see it play out in real time because it played out over such a long period of time. But the pace of change that's taking place right now, if you think about what happened from the days of the general store out on the prairie in small towns to the transformation from an agrarian agricultural to a manufacturing society in which many, many more people in urban centers, the rise of department stores, the rise of all the stores in city centers, and then in the 50s, shopping malls and shopping centers, and in the 80s and 90s, superstores. And now in the last 10 years, mobile, digital, e-commerce. But it's like Moore's law of retail. Each of those has happened in half. It was 100 years, it was 50 years, it was 25, it was 10. And we're seeing a lot of those behaviors pulled forward very, very quickly. And I think we'll see, as many have said, the change in the last 10 weeks, 10 months is equivalent to 10 years of change. And I think that's what's exciting about where we are now at this moment in time.
Matt, looking at the sort of the here and now, what are you expecting to see this holiday season? What are retailers doing differently this year? Are they prepared to cope with these unprecedented conditions?
Yeah, well, I guess I would start with where are consumers and how are consumers behaving? And the sales numbers that have come out over the last 3 months, August, September, October, there was a lot of concern that when substantial portions of the pandemic relief fiscal stimulus that had been provided by the Congress expired at the end of July, that we'd see consumers pull back from consumption and from engaging in the retail process. And quite the contrary, we've seen consumers continue to behave very robustly. We've seen great sales numbers in August, in September, in October. In each of those 3 months consecutively, retail sales have been up by more than 5% year over year relative to 2019, which is hard to believe. And if you think through the first 9 months of this year, through September 30th, retail sales in the aggregate, and again, to Darrell's point, you might not find every executive that agrees with this or has had this experience, but retail sales are up 5.8% for the year. So consumers have been out there engaging and shopping and investing, but they're doing it in ways different from last year. The categories they're in are different. There's obviously been a lot more emphasis on home, on work from home, on school from home, on entertain from home, on dining at home. So that's pushed retailers to adjust supply chains, product mixes, because consumers have been in those categories, and there's been less in some other discretionary categories, most particularly, and this has been talked about quite a bit, in the apparel category. But at both ends, at the value end and at the luxury end, we've seen consumers behave very, very robustly. So going into the holiday season, I think we should expect to see that behavior continue because of the pandemic, because of the need and the desire to think about safety first for customers, for team members, associates, for the communities in which they all work and live. The holiday season is being extended. We're used to Black Friday. We're used to massive crowds the day after Thanksgiving. We're used to some really big Saturdays, some really big weekends between Thanksgiving and the end of the year holidays. Retailers are trying to de-emphasize that kind of behavior this year. They've begun to offer Black Friday deals all the way back into October. So we're seeing different kinds of incentives for consumers to engage so that we don't drive lots of consumers to the stores when it wouldn't be healthy to do that. And I think as we've seen the coronavirus emerging again in places around the country as we get into the cooler parts of this year in the winter months, I think we'll continue to see people behaving very thoughtfully about being present physically, which will put more emphasis on delivery, on curbside and contactless payment, on buy online and pick up at the store, but not in the store maybe. So retailers have been planning for this. They had the March, April, May experiences. They knew that when we got to the holiday season, we would probably be repeating many of those experiences. So I think there were a lot of lessons learned early this year that are going to be applied to the holiday season that'll put us in much better shape. Everyone will feel much more comfortable, and I think we can still have a very, very successful holiday season.
Darrell, it's already the middle of November. If retailers run into problems at this point, is it too late for them to do anything different?
Well, I love what Matt had to say, and I do agree wholeheartedly. I think it'll be a good holiday. And I think what makes retail so interesting to work in is it's not just the acceleration that takes place, but retail moves in cycles. We love to extrapolate straight lines, but that's not the way retail works. We see fashions come and go, and we see toys come in and out, and it's constantly changing in unpredictable directions. But no, it's definitely not too late. And I think those who think it is will surrender their customers and their profits to more agile competitors. Now, it might be too late to be building fulfillment centers, although we do see retailers that are putting pop-up fulfillment centers actually in circus tents. So it might be too late to do that or to try cornering the market on Clorox wipes. But I think the most agile retailers will really be adapting throughout the entire season. They're, as Matt was saying, flattening the curve. They're trying to take off some of these peaks around Black Friday and spread them out. So we'll see people changing pricing and promotions and flexing their staff levels and adjusting their store hours and managing customer flows to comply with changing regulations state by state or country by country, and limiting customer purchases, and using pop-ups to deal with emergency capacity, and improving curbside pickups or in-store experiences. Now is the time to be preparing to handle returns, especially things like gift returns, and make those as convenient as possible, and trying to find new supplier options to fill stockouts, and dealing with non-compliant customers without creating an enormous scene or some sort of legal problem. So no, I think it is not too late. There are a lot of things that retailers are going to continue to be doing, adjusting to this holiday season. And those that do them well, it really adds up, and it can make or break a brand's reputation.
Well, we're the topic of this conversation is Agile. So speaking of Agile, can you share some quick examples of the most innovative test and learn strategies you've seen retailers deploy this year?
Sure, I'm happy to start. I don't know anyone who talks to more executives than Matt does. So, Matt, you should feel free to build on this, but there's just so many to choose from. I think there are some things that nearly everybody are doing, focusing seasonal hiring on pick and pack, or retraining store employees to be able to help with e-commerce fulfillment. Those are just kind of standard ways of operating these days. But I think a lot of retailers are adding installment paying plans to try to make it easier for consumers who are struggling with their financials. I see a lot of people that are working on ways to improve their supply chains and their delivery services. I know people accelerating their promotions, like Matt was talking about. You see Dick's doing Black Friday over 10 days, for example, and Kohl's trying to stretch it out over the entire month. And I think Walmart and Target were especially effective responding to Amazon's change in Amazon Prime days. And I think I see Walmart is transforming 42 of its regional distribution centers to increase its e-commerce fulfillment. I think that's a great move. I think you'll see people like Walmart choosing to close stores on Thanksgiving. That hasn't happened for a long, long time. I love Target's partnerships with folks like FAO Schwartz and Ulta. I see Saks doing some things to try to accelerate their technology and digital transformation. Macy's is doing a lot on the virtual front, I think, to change the Thanksgiving Day parade, for example, and moving to some virtual Santa events. I might say, by the way, as a grandfather of 8 children, I think moving to a virtual Santa may be a great innovation based on what I've seen happen, putting kids in Santa's lap. They love him on TV, not so much on the lap all the time. So I think there's going to be a lot going on with social e-commerce as well, social commerce, with companies using social commerce more as a buying site in addition to just a shopping and information sharing experience. So lots of fun things going on, I think. But Matt, again, you talk to as many retailers as anybody in the world. What are you seeing?
I think all the examples you gave are great ones, and there are many, many others. We obviously represent thousands of retail companies and love them all. So I don't want to pick on any one or two and leave anybody else out because there is so much great innovation going on. But I think if you look at areas like payments, especially looking at fulfillment, just think about some companies and the need to make the dramatic shift. If they were in that category that was not able to remain open in April and May for many, many weeks, the only real way to serve consumers was either through those distribution centers and e-commerce that you referred to, Darrell, or you had to figure out how to use your stores in a different way. And you had to get really good very quickly at the app you used, at the way you did fulfillment at curbside, how you did pickup, how you trained your staff to deal with that, how you used the store as a distribution center. So I think there's some really interesting things happening in the area of fulfillment, of using stores in a different way, as thinking about the store not only as a different experience when you're able to bring customers into the store, but how you leverage the store in a way that gives you a competitive advantage because of its proximity to consumers, even if you're not able to be open or able to serve as many customers as you would like in that location. That physical location gives you a presence, presumably in an important market, and an opportunity to serve and reach that market. So I think there's been a lot of experience gained about how stores can be used advantageously, even if you can't keep them open or you can't use them as robustly as you're used to using them. So there's been a lot of experience there. I think the entire supply chain transformation, the need to make really dramatic changes in the way we think about the supply chain, in the kinds of inventory management practices. We all remember earlier this year when there were certain categories of items that were very, very hard to find, that we had a lot of people probably purchased too many of some of those categories. They still got them in a closet somewhere, things they bought in March, and they haven't gone through it all yet. But nevertheless, there was real stress on the supply chain. And we've spent years, and I've talked to many CEOs about this, of our major retail partners. We've spent years building these supply chains, very lean inventory, very much just in time. You didn't want to hold any more than you needed to, especially in some categories. You only pulled it in when you needed it. And in an environment like this, is the supply chain going to be transformed in a way that we see sort of some permanent shift to a different approach to the supply chain, or will we simply revert back to this just-in-time, very lean inventory? So I think on the supply chain area, there's a lot to learn there. Fulfillment, which is certainly related. Payments, if you're going to do everything contactless, how good is your digital app? Suddenly, all these businesses that had pretty good apps for payment and consumer engagement realized if that's the only way they can engage with a consumer, that has to be pretty good. That's got to be the flagship store. What you carry on your handheld device, that's the flagship store. And that experience better be a good one. The other thing we saw a lot of, in part because we had stockouts in certain categories of items, but also because certain brands were not able to serve the needs of their consumers, not only because of the inventory issues, but they just weren't physically able to do it. Maybe their stores weren't open. So we see a lot of shifting consumer behavior and shifting loyalty. We saw new customers in the millions and millions in certain retail companies, picking up millions of new customers. And the ability not only to gain that share and to serve those customers, but to learn from them, because many of these are categories of consumers. They're in an age and a demographic cohort that maybe they never served before. So if we think about across all age groups, across all generations, every age group has engaged with e-commerce and with retail in a digital way at a higher level than ever before. So that's true for seniors, for boomers, for Xers, in every category. And how much of that is going to be sustained going forward will have implications for all of the things that we're talking about now, and how much of that will recede back to pre-pandemic sorts of behaviors. And I think that's what everyone is trying to figure out, is how much of this behavior sort of, we know once in a blue moon, we know the tide comes very high onto the beach. Is that it for another 100 years, or are we going to see consumers permanently coming up higher on that beach in certain categories of behavior? And I think that's what everyone's trying to understand as they think about where they make investments, how they adopt new strategies, and how they use their existing infrastructure and overhead costs to be competitive.
Matt, you just mentioned supply chains, and we're sort of looking down the road, but you see retailers evolving their supply chains in the here and now, right now? And how, if so, what's going on?
Yeah, well, I do, Steve. And I think this is another area that, again, if we go back a decade to the last recession, and you look at what happened to retail sales and what happened to the retail industry in 2008 and 9, in those years, we saw retail sales actually decrease. So we've seen this consistent growth over the last decade, retail sales increasing an average of about between 3.5 to 3.8% a year, marching, just growing. In the aggregate, again, to Darrell's point, not every retail CEO we would talk to would say that's been their experience, but in the aggregate, consumers have continued to drive consumption and economic growth in this country. In 2008-9, that was actually down. We actually gave up sales in those years. So this has been a different environment. But coming out of that last recession, there were many examples of retail companies that were just left with far more inventory than they needed, that they had to mark down. And we've sort of been in a cycle for many years of trying to get inventory under control, trying to get supply chains under control, and the buying pattern that exists when you're buying 6-8 months in advance. In the middle of winter, you're buying, or the previous fall, you're buying for the following summer. And you're sort of out of cycle on the apparel side in particular. And how do you get that under control? And so that, and then in a broader category of goods, the relationship, particularly with a large supplier like China, there's been a lot of focus and attention on that relationship in particular the last 4 or 5 years because of the political climate in the United States especially, and the emphasis on trying to rethink the manufacturing base and supply chains. And not to mention the fact that in China, costs are going up. Once upon a time, China was a really low cost labor market. Well, that's not true anymore. So there's been an ongoing effort to diversify supply chains. And then you see some companies that sort of are very, very effective, especially in the fast fashion category, that are very effective at compressing the inventory turn times. So that gives them a competitive advantage. They can find an item that works. They can get it in the market very quickly. When that item's gone, they move on to the next item. That's disrupted thinking about supply chains as well. So there's a whole combination, I think, of factors, again, all of which are being accelerated by COVID-19 and are causing retailers to rethink their supplier relationships, their supplier partnerships, where they do business, how they do business, to ensure that they can be much more efficient going forward. And Darrell alluded to this. I think there's a recognition now among many executives and many companies that no matter how much innovation they thought they were applying to various challenges they face in their business, you learn it through an experience like this, so you can actually do more than you thought you could. If you really have to do it more quickly, you can. And I think that's one of the lessons that's being applied in lots of places, but maybe particularly in the supply chain, that there's even more emphasis that you can make on transforming your supply chain, on redirecting it to other markets, on trying to diversify. At some point, we'll get to an equilibrium. I mean, there's some things you're just not going to take out of a market like China because they're too good at producing certain items. There's too much integration in some parts of the supply chain. But for those items that can be moved to other markets, other places in Asia, other places in South and Latin America, other places in North Africa, there are places around the world you can do business. And people are trying to explore those very, very quickly. And I think working with a high degree of collaboration with their partners to try to think through that.
Darrell, given some of the things that Matt just talked about, the sort of the longer term shifts that we're seeing in the supply chains and also all the uncertainty, it sounds like it's really important to make supply chains more adaptive and agile. How can you do that? Does it take years, or are there things that you could do actually quickly? And what are the processes companies or retailers can employ to make that happen?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be truthful, yes, it does take years. In fact, I think the best retailers would tell you that building an agile supply chain is never really done. The trick is to get started. And figuring out how to get started, I think, is the tough part. But I think what we've learned about retail operations in general and in supply chains in particular, what we've learned is you can't just predict and command and control in this kind of an environment, because no matter how much research you do, no matter how smart you are, no matter how much you analyze things, these current environments are simply unpredictable. And so you can waste a lot of time trying to predict what you're going to need in your supply chain. But the truth of the matter is, chances are good you're wrong. And so I know folks like Target started working on this 5 years ago. And one of the reasons they're so successful today in doing things like buy online and pick up in store and ship from store is because they started developing this. And there are trade-offs, there's balance. For a long time, retailers focused on creating efficiency. And now they're wondering, do we need to shift more towards flexibility? And flexibility, like insurance, costs money. So how much do we want to make a trade-off like that in a world of unpredictable and accelerating change? Right now, we're all worried about the pandemic. And of course, that's a terrible and impossible thing to predict. But when this passes, there will be other things. There will be digital disruptions. There will be social unrest. There will be military conflicts. We're having increasing numbers of hurricanes and natural disasters. So I think retail executives are realizing that we just live in a world of constant crises and black swan events these days. And so in supply chains, yes, it will take years to do it, but the 80-20 rule applies to supply chains just like everything else. And so what we've been doing with retailers is taking those supply chains, big, large, complex problems, breaking them down into about 30 modules and saying, well, let's prioritize and sequence these efforts so that we will get 80% of the benefits with the first 20% of the efforts. And maybe that's changing the assortments, or maybe it's improving allocations, or maybe it's modeling the network and redesigning the network, or managing returns. But we go through that with each individual retailer, quantify the benefits, quantify the cost of delay, and then start prioritizing and sequencing. And I will say the first two things that almost always come to the surface are, number one, you have to fix the feedback loops because you can't predict this stuff. So you've got to improve your feedback loops with your customers, with your frontline employees, with your suppliers. And we often find that the data itself is just wrong or outdated. And then the second thing I would say is you have to be building these supply chains like everything else from the customer's back, always from the customer's back, because nothing wastes more time and money than developing the wrong thing. The things that you think are important, but it turns out are not important to customers. And so we've got a lot of executives right now who assume that every customer demands faster and, by the way, higher cost deliveries, even though folks like, if you're in the home improvement business, professional home remodelers, they don't want a truckload of appliances dumped on their site 3 days earlier than they planned. It's just going to sit out in the rain for 3 days. What they want is orders to arrive on time and in full and undamaged. So it really varies retailer by retailer, customer by customer. And I think the key to success is to design these supply chains in ways that'll give your targeted customers what they value most, and build in flexibility, build in the possibility that our predictions are likely going to be wrong.
So you're talking about, instead of making a bet and just sticking with it, it sounds like you're talking about trying to test more and learn more in real time. Is that right, or am I getting that wrong?
No, you're exactly right. That's exactly what I'm saying. I think too many retailers were accustomed to what Matt was describing earlier, of maybe there'll be transformational changes every 100 years or 50 years or 20 years. Well, that's not true anymore. Now what we're facing is environments of much greater volatility, and therefore the whole system has to be changed. There's a common phrase in retail of retail is detail. And yes, that's an important part of retail. But an equally important part of retail these days is how do you move as fast as your customers? How do you move as fast as technology is changing? How do you move as fast as the economy is changing? And that's a different set of skills that I think retailers are still learning how to develop.
Many retailers are locking in their strategic plans and budgets as we speak. What's the right way to do that in a world of constant crises? Darrell, why don't you first take that?
Sure, I'll take a crack at it. You know, if I could give my retailer friends just one gift this holiday season, I think it would be this one. I think it would be giving them a better planning and budgeting process, because the planning and budgeting process in retail is so painful and often misguided. You're going to think I'm making this up, but it is not unusual for retailers to start their planning and budgeting process in August. And so they're spending 5 months, 6 months developing strategic plans and budgets. And this year, most of those plans and budgets went out the window in March. And so if you spend 6 months planning and 2 months later it's obsolete, what good have you done? It's not unusual when I ask retailers, how are you doing? Their first response is usually something like, great, I am right on plan. And I'll say, congratulations. What is plan? And the answer might be down 5%. Well, to me, that's like saying, how are you doing? And having them say, I'm great. Well, I'm sick, but I expected to be sick. So I'm right on plan. It's retailers get confused, I think, sometimes over the difference between outperforming the market and just meeting plan, particularly if that plan is now obsolete or out of date. So I think retailers right now have a perfect opportunity to be making a clean break this year. And if it were me, if I were running this process for a retailer, there are three things I would change. I would change the purpose of planning and budgeting, because I think a lot of people think the purpose of planning and budgeting in retail is to deliver smooth earnings. And it turns out that's not important. In fact, our analysis shows that smooth, predictable earnings explain only 1 or 2% of shareholder value. And you get 30 times more impact from actually improving returns and accelerating growth. So the purpose of planning and budgeting is not to predict and command and control and just keep people on plan. It's to adapt and improve performance. And I think that's the second thing that I would change is do your planning and budgeting from strategy down, not from optimizing projects up. Take your strategic guidelines and say, if this is right, where would we be investing our money, our scarce resources? And then the third thing I'd say is plan faster and more frequently. Don't spend 6 months doing an annual plan. Take a month at a time and do a quarterly plan. Adapt, test, control, do it like a venture capitalist would fund any of their ventures, where when a business unit is looking for $100 million, give 10 million of it in seed capital or Series A funding, see how that turns out. If it's not turning out well, stop it. Stop more quickly, pivot, figure out how to change with your Series B funding or your Series C funding. And I think simply by changing planning and budgeting in most retailers, I think we could significantly improve performance and the satisfaction of customers and employees.
Matt, we know that necessity drives innovation, and we've heard from both of you about the ways retailers have been innovative throughout the course of the pandemic. In your opinion, is the sector going far enough and innovating fast enough? I mean, Darrell was just talking about shorter cycles and being more responsive with planning and budgeting. And what are your thoughts about how retailers are innovating?
Steve, I'd go back, for example, to to the use of stores and thinking about using stores in a different way as a very visible example of innovation. I think we all recognize that in the United States, relative to other markets, this is a different kind of a market, much bigger country, big mobile population. Nevertheless, I think we've seen over the last few years, and specifically over the last few months, that maybe we've got more real estate than we need devoted to certain kinds of consumer behaviors and consumer activities. That kind of transformation is going to accelerate as we get into the next year, and we've been seeing that happen as retailers have sort of been editing their real estate footprints and their profiles, and we've seen innovation taking place in the way in which different businesses, especially for example in the department store and the apparel sector, have been using their stores in new ways to make those assets more productive. So I think the notion that you need to be more flexible and think more about adaptability, think more about agility in the strategic plan, in the budgeting process. I think all those philosophies are absolutely on point. Obviously, given the scale and diversity of retail businesses, not every company is going to be able to apply some of these philosophies that Darrell was just outlining as aggressively as others. Nevertheless, I think directionally, all of those ideas make sense. And so when it comes to innovation, we've seen, and we talked about this at the beginning, in a variety of ways, retailers really forced to innovate at a higher level than ever before because of the external environment and the circumstances. And we've seen that historically, that sometimes the way to bring about change and to bring about transformation, going again back to the last recession, 2008-9, there was a lot of transformation that came out of that recession. And certainly think about many, in particular, digital companies that came onto the market in those years. They were born of that disruption in the environment and the opportunities that created, both to transform existing businesses and to create new ones. So I think we'll see that. And I think this generation of retail leaders is well prepared to take the lessons of the current environment and not only meet the challenges of the moment and continue to keep their teams and their customers and their communities safe and healthy, but also going forward to really apply these lessons in a way that shows continued transformation and change. When we went through the last recession, there were in 2008, 2009, an average of 400 retail bankruptcies in each of those 2 years. So almost 800 bankruptcies, retail companies of all sizes and shapes. In this current 8 months, 9 months, there have been about 40 announced bankruptcies, the overwhelming majority of which are going to be restructurings. So we're not seeing the same dramatic shakeout in terms of companies that we saw the last time, in part because consumers have continued to shop and be engaged and provide opportunities for these retail businesses to transform and change themselves. There will certainly be, as we've said, winners and losers in this category. The winners will be those that were able to take the lessons and the philosophies that we're talking about and actually apply them. And the losers will be those who are not able to adapt as quickly, who, as Darrell would say, are not able to be agile and make that transformation. Because I think we can see where the market is headed. We know where consumers are going. We can't exactly predict the future, but we know we need to be more flexible, more progressive, more forward thinking in the way we build supply chains and consumer engagement, response times, all of those things. They all may know it. They just may not all be able to get there.
Darrell, would you like to add anything to that?
First of all, Matt is absolutely right. And I do believe that retailers are doing more innovation than ever before. And they feel good about that. Personally, I think I would like to see even more innovation. And I would like to see bigger, bolder innovations in retail. When I meet with a retail executive, I like to ask a couple of questions, and partially because I'm so interested in Agile. But one of them is I'll say, tell me about the biggest breakthrough innovations that you have introduced over the last 5 years. And there's often an awkward pause because they'll talk about innovations that a lot of other people are doing, or moving the cookies to be closer to the milk or something like that. But there's a tendency to focus on incremental innovations as opposed to breakthrough innovations. And often it's hard to point to 3 or 4 major disruptive innovations that a retailer has introduced, whereas in other industries, you see those quite frequently. And then the second question I'll often ask is, how do you develop breakthrough innovations? And I often hear descriptions of how people do new product development, but not so much about how do we do business model breakthroughs or how do we do operating model breakthroughs. And then the third question I'll often ask is, does your organization look to you, to the C-suite, as the most inspirational example for how an agile team should work? Are you showing them how quickly people can adapt, how we can remove bureaucratic red tape, how we can empower people, how we can test and learn? And too often I find that it's a responsibility that they're delegating to subordinates rather than adopting at the C-suite level. All of these are things that I'd love to see change, just because, I don't mean to sound negative. It's just that I see so much opportunity. I see so much need and opportunity to innovate at a bigger and a faster level. And when I see that kind of possibility, I just get anxious. I get eager to get after it. And I've seen when retailers do that, they're happier, their employees are happier, their customers are happier, their shareholders are happier. It's all good. It's just a new skill that needs to be strengthened and broadened in the organization, I think.
Another topic is it's come up in some of the questions that have been posed is pricing. Matt, how has the pandemic impacted pricing, given a lot of things that we've seen, including scarcity of some items, and how does Agile play into pricing decisions?
Well, I think one thing that we've seen is that in certain categories, because we've had shortages or relatively limited amounts of some categories, some retailers have taken some of the promotional nature out of those product categories. So there's been a little more pricing integrity. Again, if you think about particularly some of the apparel categories, luxury categories, there are things that don't have to be marked down, don't need to be on sale to move them, because there aren't that many to begin with, because of the decisions retailers made early this year. If we think back, and it's hard to think this way now, but back in February, many observers were looking at what was happening in China with COVID-19 and thinking this is going to be a supply chain problem. It's going to be a supply problem. We know very quickly it turned into potentially a demand problem. But back at the beginning, there was a thought that, well, if this is relatively well contained and it's limited to this market, that's an important market for supply. So boy, a lot of those products that we get out of that market, we won't be able to get because those supply chains won't be running. Well, the Chinese and Asian generally got their supply chains back up and running pretty quickly as they came through their lockdowns. But many of the retailers in this country had taken dramatic changes to their suppliers and their relationships and their inventories that they'd ordered, because by then they realized there might be a demand problem on this side. And there was no way to know what that might look like. So retailers are in much better shape now in terms of managing their inventory, particularly in the apparel and the department store categories. They've really done a nice job, I think, of ensuring that they were not going to be left with a lot of exposure in certain categories. Again, maybe with the muscle memory of what happened in 2008 and 9, don't want to go back there again and be left with a lot of merchandise that has to be marked down to be moved. And as a result, I don't think you're going to see big markdowns and big promotions. There are certainly the planned for promotions around Black Friday and the holiday season. Those are planned for well in advance in lots of product categories. Those are done in a way that they can still be profitable, and they've got arrangements with suppliers that make those sensible to do. But I do think that you're going to see a little, maybe a little more pricing integrity and price sustainability here because of inventory management and the ability to hold the line on pricing and not have to mark things down to move them.
Darrell, one of the most enlightening pieces of your book was about ways companies get Agile wrong. Where do you see retailers doing Agile wrong most commonly?
Oh, let me count the ways. um, I think there are a few things. One, executives who don't really understand Agile, I think sometimes set very naive expectations. I think they expect too much too fast with too little effort. We see what we call big bang transformations of let's just divide everybody up into squads and tribes and chapters and guilds. I spend a lot of my time undoing that. We talked about delegating Agile instead of doing it. I think a big one is changing structures instead of ways of working and bungling the business definitions. A lot of people are turning Agile into a euphemism for layoffs, which I despise. We'll lay off 30% of our people because, oh, we're going to become more Agile. And it just introduces chaos. I think I see a lot of people doing inept or inconsistent Agile, different ways, different approaches all over the company. And I see a lot of good Agile teams getting trapped in bad bureaucratic operating models. So the budget or the planning process or the people allocation won't let them get done what they need to get done. One of the biggest problems I see is people thinking from the inside out instead of from the customer back. Agile is all about customer obsession. And I think also failing to harmonize and inspire both innovators and operators. I think the frontline workers in retail are the heroes in retail, to tell you the truth. And I think we could help them just by listening to them, just by paying attention to them, recognizing their contributions. There are some people that do that right. About 8 years ago, I was in a Costco store, and one of the guys who checked my receipt going out was a guy named Reggie. This is in Waltham, Massachusetts. And I found out the day before going in that he had been one of two winners of a $50 million lottery. 50 million. So he had $25 million. And the next day I was in the store and he was still checking me out, checking my receipt. And I was saying, Reggie, you just won $25 million. What are you doing checking my receipt? And he said, I like working here. My friends are here. What am I going to do if I'm not doing this? And for a couple of years, I saw him every day. I wish that every retailer could learn as much as they could learn from frontline employees and that they would recognize them and celebrate them. Because in my opinion, those are the real heroes of retail.
That's amazing. Is he still there today?
No, he's not there today, but he hung on for a lot longer than most people would in a lot of other jobs.
Speaking of people like that, what's your thinking about the critical employees on the front line this holiday season, Matt? How do you see retailers trying to keep their employees happy and motivated?
Well, I'm glad to hear Darrell say the things he just did. We've been talking about retail employees. I've been calling them economic first responders from the beginning of this year. If you think about the heroic behavior of those retail employees in businesses all across the country, going all the way back through March, that kept so many of these brand names in business, serving all the rest of us so we could stay home and be safe and take care of our families, and many of us continue to go to work. They really are heroes, and they really are economic first responders, and with all the respect that they deserve for the work they've done, putting themselves out there so we could all go on and live our lives. And so I think we've seen retail companies step up again and again. First of all, hiring hundreds and hundreds of thousands of people in stores to serve customers, to do the fulfillment, to make sure the shelves are stocked, and to do the cleaning, all the things that keep all the rest of us safe. We've seen retailers step up in terms of the personal protective equipment that they provided from the very beginning to protect their teams, and the way that they have also encouraged their customers to adopt new behaviors to keep everyone safe. And then we've seen it really, the benefits, the pay, the compensation, the bonuses, the sick leave, the scheduling, the flexibility, all of the things that retailers have provided. And I talk to CEOs, as Darrell has alluded to, in most, if not all, of the nation's major retail businesses. And they're out every week talking to those frontline employees, learning from them, understanding their experiences, applying those lessons and those thoughts. I haven't named any companies, but I'll, Sam Walton was the ultimate, management by walking around executive. He was in stores talking to employees all the time and was a great believer in the philosophy that Darrell outlined, that you get all your best ideas from your frontline employees because they're the ones engaging with your customers. And I think that's a philosophy that is very much embraced by today's generation of retail leaders. And when I speak to them, I know that's how they spend their time. And I think this holiday season, we'll see our retail employees really responding in a very positive way. I think they feel like they've been prioritized, as they have been. Every retail executive I talk to, when I ask, what's the first thing you think about when you think about tackling and handling the coronavirus, the first thing every retailer says is our team, our employees, our associates, our partners. And you've seen that consistently across the board in every segment of retail. And I think that's really reassuring for all of us. And we ought to all be humbled and grateful at the sacrifices they've made to serve everyone in the United States.
Well, thank you, Matt. I'm afraid we're out of time. It's been a great conversation, and I want to thank all of you for joining us here today. I'll now turn it over to Darrell to tell us where folks can get more information about Agile.
Thanks. Well, first of all, I just want to say, Steve, thank you so much for hosting this and moderating it. And Matt, it's so good to see you, my friend. You are always brilliant. I have so much respect for your contributions to the retail industry. I feel bad we're not going to get to all the questions that we have today. I just say go on to Bain.com, Doing Agile Right. There's a section there where you can ask questions and we'll respond and give answers. You can connect with the authors of the book, Doing Agile Right. And I'd just say, happy holidays, stay happy, stay healthy. We look forward to talking to you. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks, Darrell.
Thank you, guys.
Bye-bye.